Indonesia has committed to reach net zero emissions by 2060 or sooner, an ambitious task given the country's growth objective and status as a globally important consumer and producer of coal. However, a shortage of funds could hamper the country's energy transition initiative.
Indonesia's energy transition program has been implemented for several years, but its progress is still not in line with expectations. Apart from financial problems, policy issues also still hamper the energy transition program. Indonesia's closest target is to achieve a 23% renewable energy mix by 2025. Meanwhile, under the Just Energy Transition Partnership or JETP agreement signed during the G20 summit in Bali in November 2022, Indonesia has set a renewable energy mix target of 34% by 2030. Indonesia is also optimistic of reaching a net zero emissions target by 2060 or sooner. In this increasingly short time span, the progress of the energy transition in Indonesia is still quite slow. The Transition Readiness Framework developed by the Institute for Essential Services Reform or IESR since 2020 noted that in 2022 there were no significant developments in various energy transition sectors in Indonesia. Political commitment in energy transition policies, as well as investment for the development of renewable energy sources, remain low. It cannot be denied that there is an increase in the installed capacity of renewable energy every year. However, this capacity addition is not high enough to meet Indonesia's renewable energy capacity targets, in an effort to limit the increase in the Earth's average temperature to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Indonesia still relies heavily on funding from abroad to finance the costly energy transition projects. In fact, Indonesia has received a commitment from several developed countries to finance this project during the G20 summit in Bali, November 2022. Under the Just Energy Transition Partnership or JETP, the G7 group of industrialized countries plus Denmark and Norway has committed to provide up to $20 billion to help Indonesia finance its energy transition program. Before the money can start flowing, however, Indonesia has to draft an investment plan that will serve as a guideline for how the money will be used, such as shutting down coal-fired power plants and developing renewable energy. That investment plan was supposed to be launched to the public on August the 16th, but it was delayed because the draft didn't include data on so-called captive coal plants. On Wednesday, November the 1st, the Just Energy Transition Partnership Secretariat finally announced the draft of the Comprehensive Investment and Policy Plan, or CIPP, for the partnership. Under the plan, Indonesia has pledged to cut carbon emissions to 250 million metric tons for its on-grid power sector in 2030. And increase its share of renewable energy generation to 44% under a Just Energy Transition Partnership or JETP. While the plan is aimed at securing $20 billion in G7 funding, with $10 billion of public funding pledged and $10 billion due from private lenders, the JETP Secretariat said in its plan it had identified more than 400 priority projects that would require at least $67.4 billion of investment. The plan showed that $153.8 million of the $20 billion pledged had been identified as grants. The rest of the public financing could include concessional loans at below market rates, the Secretariat said. Indonesia's JETP office would match projects with appropriate financing terms and structures, based on priorities, it said. Private financing can come in the form of commercial loans that carry market rates, equity investments, or other structures, according to the plan. Hopefully, the Comprehensive Investment and Policy Plan, or CIPP, for the partnerships can be immediately approved so that investors will have a clear guideline to investors to involved in the energy transition program. Only with a clear regulation and legal certainty, investors will come and take part in the country's energy transition program.
The government has introduced a number of initiatives in accelerating the country's clean energy transition, but the progress is still far from our expectation. Our guest this afternoon, Putra Adhiguna, Asia Technology Lead at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, IEEFA, will discuss problems which have so far hampered Indonesia's energy transition program. Good afternoon, Pak Putra. Thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Fong. Thank you for having me.
All right, so as we already know, Indonesia has implemented a number of programs to achieve 23% renewable energy mix by 2025 or 34% by 2030 under the Jetp agreement signed during the G20 summit in Bali. So based on your opinion, how well the progress of our country's energy transition program?
I think when we talk about Indonesia, Indonesia has just barely started its energy transition. There's a lot of positive signal coming from the governments, big companies like PLN, including private corporations. But to put it into context, I'd like to compare us to India, for example, right? I mean, we have a major project in solar generation that we call the Chirata power plant. It's been on the news for basically the last 18 months. Now, as a comparison, India built the same capacity every 4 days last year. So we have a lot of catching up to do. So there's a lot of positive signal and we're hopeful, but there's a lot of catching up to do.
All right, so talking about, this topic, about energy transition, based on data from the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, the renewable energy mix in the country in 2022 only reached 12.3% of the 23% target by 2025. And that's going to be like 3 years from now. So do you think we need to do something?
We need to be much more aggressive if that's the main questions, right? I mean, Indonesia has at least 3 fundamental challenges in reforming our power system. The first one is that we've overbuilt a lot of power capacity in the last 10 years. So we have a lot of excess power in the coal power sector. Now, the second part is that since we have too many excess capacity, there's going to be a reluctance from the main players like the state utility to procure a lot of new renewable capacity. Now, couple this with this new energy transition, there's going to be a lot of demand for renewable energies from private and public corporations, but PLN can be challenging to absorb a lot of built new capacity because they are in a financial limit of what they're doing. So obviously the government need to acknowledge that the past has somewhat ended, right? When I say it that way, what I'm saying is that if we want to build new coal power plant today, it's going to be very difficult to get the financing. But we need to start making the step forward. But in between, there's a lot of ambiguity, so to say. So we need to be very clear on what PLN can and willing to do and what the government is willing to do as well.
All right, so you mentioned a little bit about the financial aspect. So do you think that's going to be our biggest challenge?
One of the biggest challenges, yes. And this is actually one of the topics that people don't like to mention because we're seeing 2 different financial aspects. The first one is the sustainability of PLN as a state-owned enterprise. And the second one is about financing the new projects. A lot of people like to talk about the second part, but forget the first part. Because at the end of the day, PLN is the gatekeeper of Indonesia's energy transition. Yes. So by saying that is that the government needs to look very closely on where PLN is today, how we can reform certain things to help them in making this step forward.
So that means we need to think of this both sides of the PLN condition, right? But we also know that the PLN plans to shut down coal-fired power plants with total capacity of up to 6.7 gigawatts by 2040. So do you think this program will disrupt the PLN's strategy in the future?
So at this moment, I don't think so. But first of all, we need to listen to the latest update from the Jetp team, where they say on a recent statement is that the reductions, accelerated coal retirement is actually less than 2 gigawatts. So it's a much smaller scale that we're seeing right now. So when we want to understand state entities like PLN, we need to look at it from the natural lifetime of their coal-fired or gas-fired power plant. This can last anything between 20, 30 to 40 years. So there's going to be a lot of assumptions. How long will a PLN coal-fired power plant last? So when somebody say, we are going to retire X amount of gigawatt by 2040, this is just business as usual for many utility companies, because obviously when you build a power plant, there will be a lifetime for that power plant. So when they say 2040, X gigawatt will be retired, so PLN better hurry and build the new capacity into the replacement.
Okay, but we also know that the Jetp financing scheme have opened a lot of opportunity for PLN to finance its new or renewable projects. However, these countries who have already signed the scheme are reluctant to give the money. Why most of them are backing up from this agreement?
Right. So first of all, the coal early retirement is the new model. Nobody has implemented this on a large scale globally. So I think it's a learning process for every party that's involved, whether it was the partner group, PLN, and Indonesian government. So everybody knows from the start it's not going to be easy, because the credibility of the retirement to the international community hinges on so many different things. Let me bring you an example. What is the guarantee that when you retire, for example, 1 gigawatt of coal-fired power plant here, that you will not just move it to another coal-fired power plant? So these kind of questions are important. So I think the final challenges onto these financials and policies eventually surfaces that it's not going to be easy. The secondly, however, is that when the Jetp was announced on the last G20, there was a lot of underestimation on the amount of industrial coal-fired power plant that was planned. And this was quite significant. So I would speculate that this has also become a sticking point with the partner groups as well, because what we're basically saying is that please help us to retire those in PLN's power grid, but at the same time we're building another 10 or 20 gigawatt on the other side that is outside of the view. So I think there's multiple factors in play here. So.
Okay, so do you think we should stop immediately the power plant or new power plant for coal?
I think it's impossible. I mean, to be blunt, I mean, Indonesia is still an emerging economy. We're at the development phase where we want to build industries. So new power capacity will be needed. However, what is also needed is that we need to also do a more honest review of where we are today in order for us to step forward. Because what I'm worried is that we're in this twilight zone between the past and the future, like I mentioned earlier. Nobody is willing to finance new coal-fired power plant. And so that part is done. But the new one cannot start because in between we have a lot of this ambiguity. This ambiguity can be PLN excess power capacity, or this ambiguity can be the industrial parks that is building a lot of new coal-fired power plants. So to your question, I think it's impossible for us to do so, but there's going to be a lot of internal discussion, I'm sure, between the government and various stakeholders to need to look into the other alternatives as well. Whether we're talking about what is the capacity of the hydropower, what is the capacity of the other sources that we can tap into for Indonesia's industrial development.
So if we cannot use the Jetp scheme, then what else that we can do in order to finance our project?
Right. So two things on this. First of all, energy transition will cost money, and it will cost a lot of money. Obviously, the partner groups are not the boundaries of our energy transition. Just in the last few weeks, we've seen the Chinese involvement in a lot of signing of memorandum of understanding with PLNs and the Indonesian government. So that can be an avenue as well. Now, how we should see the Jetp is that this is the first time that Indonesia, both the government and PLN, is undergoing a comprehensive reviews of all the projects in Indonesia. So this is the first time that we actually can go through those lists, see which one is prioritized and which one is not, and then put it on the table. So whomever will come to the table, whether it's the partner group, whether it's going to be from China or any other countries, are welcome. Now, the second part of this, however, is that for Indonesia to be able to source itself financing for its energy transition, I think it's important to look into the existing resources as well. What I'm saying is this. Right now, Indonesia is imposing a lot of price cap policy, where we're talking about coal, gas, biofuels, and so forth. There's a lot of internal subsidies beyond the traditional fuel and electricity subsidies. Now, what I'd like to highlight is that these price caps essentially build walls for the energy transition. So while the world is transitioning away, by building a price cap, what we're doing is basically telling the solar companies or the wind companies, well, you can't compete because not only that we have cheap coal-fired power plant, we also have cheap gas and cheap coal because we put a price cap on it. So it's important for us to look at it more strategically, whether we can allocate some of those economic rents, not building price cap, but putting a levy fund, putting something that we can slowly build into the energy transition. So that's a suggestion.
That's pretty hard to do, I think.
I would imagine so, but it's...
All right, okay, so so besides solar and maybe hydro power, we also have potential renewable energy such as geothermal. Why do you think is not many investors interested in investing in this aspect or in this sector?
So geothermal is fundamentally risky because it's kind of like the oil and gas where you put investment but you may or may not get the resources. But at a more fundamental level, the challenge with geothermal is risk, but it's really about tariff. 10 years ago, when you talk to the people in industry, they say, we can't get a proper tariff to get the economic break-even point. And now it's still pretty much the same story. There has been improved policies, we have the presidential regulation just recently issued, but the tariff issues is really challenging because, again, it cannot compete with other technologies. So the risk factor, there's a few things that the government has been doing, doing a government exploration, funded drilling, and so forth, but it remains a challenge. And I guess the first big question that the government and PLN need to answer is that when is your upcoming procurement for the geothermal? How much tariff will you be offering and, lay it bare on the table so we can actually clearly see where the challenges will be. Because again, the risk and the tariff has always been a challenge and the landscape hasn't changed much in the last few years.
So what can we do to lure investors then?
When we talk about geothermal, lowering the risk profile of the exploration is critical. And what the government right now is doing is very interesting. So they engage with multilateral banks and other external parties to try to do partial funding recoveries in doing the geothermal. What it does effectively, if it works, is that it'll reduce, say, the price of the geothermal power from 10 cents to maybe 8 cents or 9 cents. Those are small increments, but those are important. So the government is doing this. What is not clear is what has been the outcome of this. So the government have been saying this in the past 2 years, but what is the outcome and what is the progress, I think that remains to be seen. Now, other things like reform and regulation has been discussed, but I guess fundamentally, again, I think all parties just need to be honest about how much are they willing to pay to procure X amount of technology within the next few years. Because I think there's a lot of room for ambiguity here, because when PLN, for example, or the government outline, this is the plan for the next 10 years. Some of that may be realized, but some others may not. And this uncertainty is causing a lot of confusion, so to say. So I think more clarity on that will be needed.
Okay, so that means geothermal is still far away to be implemented as the main source for reaching the target. So
we're hopeful,
that means,
but it's still going to be some time away.
Okay, so that means we can go back to the solar or hydropower energy then. But when you see today's development on that sector, do you think it will be helpful for Indonesia to achieve its renewable or energy transition target?
It will be. Hydropower, for example, is usually developed in both small and larger scale. So it can help because it provides what we call the baseload power, which is basically power that's constantly stable. So that makes the job easier for companies like PLN. Now, when we talk about solar, one of the reasons that solar has been in the center of the global energy transition is because you can deploy it at a very rapid pace. You're talking about 12 to 18 months, you can build it and get it up and running. So right now, Indonesia is still less than 0.05% of its potential development. Now, the job is not easy because there's going to be a lot of power transmissions that need to be invested by PLN, but the key aspect of solar is really its ability to be deployed at a rapid scale, and also it can be made both at a small and a large scale. So both small players and big players can enter the picture as they see fit.
At the moment, what is the main obstacle for us to use or explore more on the solar sector?
There are several. So coming back to the point I highlighted earlier, number one is really the clarity of how much PLN is willing to procure within the next few years, because that gives a strong signal about the demand. Now, on the other side, sometimes there is what we call the development of the industrial players. For example, if you have a shoe factory, what they usually do or they want to do is to build a solar power plant on their rooftops. Now, this has been quite slow. Sometimes it's going fast, sometimes it's going slow. So I think more consistency is needed on that side. Now, obviously, one thing when we talk about solar is the sensitivity about importing equipments. And this has always been a sensitive point for the government, because about 80 to 90% of the solar equipment is usually imported. So building a domestic supply chain to produce a portion of this technology will be important. And we've seen some progress in that within the last 1 month. I think there's some good news. And I think to develop the domestic industry, they will need a strong demand. So it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. So both would hopefully need to be developed at the same time, because we need a competitive energy, but those that are produced also domestically.
Do you think if we focus more on this strategy, meaning the solar power, do you think we can lure more investors to finance our project to reach a target for the energy transition in Indonesia?
I believe all need to be working at the same pace. We're talking about hydropower, we're talking about geothermal, we're talking about solar and wind and so forth. So when we talk about energy transition, it's important for us not to speak either or, but really to get all the cylinders running at the same time. Now, how do we prioritize certain things is important. To your point, yes, certain technology that can be deployed quickly should take a little bit of priority, but that doesn't also mean that others should be left behind, because everything really needs to go at the same time.
Okay, my final question. In regard to today's condition, do you think will we be able to reach the target?
The target is difficult, and frankly, it's near impossible. Let's put it that way. But I think what's important for us is not to focus on the absolute figures. What's important for us and the public is to push the government into what is the realization plan for the next 12 months. Now, one thing I'd like to add on this is that climate net zero has always been presented in multi-decades target. So it's so easy if you're a stakeholder to say, we will do this in the next 30 years. And I think this discussion needs to be condensed into a very narrow time frame. So what is important is to look at what would PLN, what would the industries, and what would the government do in the next 18 months. And I think by that, we can get much better. Whether the number will be reached, I think it's immaterial at this moment, because what we're looking at as progress, and it's not the absolute figure.
All right. Thank you very much,
Thank you so much
for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, moving on to another news. Indonesian President Joko Widodo has called on the Nusantara Capital City Authority to prioritize domestic investors for the construction of public facilities and infrastructure in the country's future capital city, or IKN.
Although a number of foreign investors from Singapore, South Korea, and Japan have shown interest in building public facilities and infrastructure in Indonesia's future capital city, Nusantara, in East Kalimantan, President Joko Widodo has asked the new capital city authority to prioritize local investors. Speaking in his remarks during the groundbreaking ceremony of the Pakuan Nusantara project in the IKN area, President said that a priority should be given to local investors in developing infrastructure projects in the new capital city.
Singapura jauh-jauh ke sini melihat kalau nggak berminat untuk apa. Kemudian dari Korea 30 orang, dari Jepang juga 30 orang, dari Malaysia dari Uni Emirat Arab.
Hundreds of foreign investors from Singapore, Japan, South Korea, and the United Arab Emirates have shown their interest in investing in IKN. Some have even begun their projects. In fact, the president revealed that investors from the UAE had proposed to construct a building block for a financial center. The president was on a working visit in the country's future capital city on Wednesday to officially kick off constructions of several projects ranging from an airport, toll road and hospital to a hotel in a planned new capital city, Nusantara. Jokowi's $32 billion flagship project to move the seat of government out of the congested city of Jakarta has struggled to attract private investment.
Wall Street rose Friday as market reacted to a soft jobs report in the United States, which drove bond yields lower. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 222.24 points, or 0.66%, to 34,061. The S&P 500 climbed 0.94% to 4,358. Meanwhile, the Nasdaq Composite jumped 1.38% to 13,478. Bond yields, which have weighed on the stock market the last 3 months, tumbled on Friday following the softer than expected payrolls figures.
Stocks on Wall Street rallied Thursday on hopes the U.S. Federal Reserve
Better than expectations, the U.S. economy last month added 150,000 jobs, below the 170,000 payrolls increase consensus estimate from Dow Jones. Analysts have said that the weak jobs data may signify the positive result from Federal Reserve's attempt to cool the economy and stifle inflation. Share prices on the Indonesian stock exchange mostly rose on Friday as investors responded to the signs from the Federal Reserve that rate hike trend may have ended. The Jakarta Composite Index ended the Friday session with an increase of 0.55% to 6,788. On a weekly basis, the JCI rose by 0.44%. Meanwhile, foreign investors recorded net buying of 309.3 billion rupiah on Friday, or equivalent of 19.8 million US dollar. However, over the week, foreign investors recorded net selling of 2.84 trillion rupiah. Meanwhile, the rupiah strengthened against US dollar on Friday as the market responded to the signs of Federal Reserve ending the rate hike trend. The rupiah strengthened to 15,727 per US dollar on Friday, increasing by 1.33% from 15,939 per US dollar seen a week before. Analysts have said the US dollar weakening seemed to follow the Fed's sign that it may have ended its monetary tightening cycle. The weakened greenback follows 10-year US Treasury bond yield, which decreased to its lowest level in the past 3 weeks. And that wraps up our edition of Economic Outlook. I am Velina Daniel. Thanks for watching and goodbye.